This series is organized by the Ziman Center's Housing as Healthcare Initiative, the UCLA Center for Healthy Climate Solutions, and the Center for Impact at Anderson. And today's event partner also includes the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. Just a quick review. Our first seminar series set the landscape of current climate threats in our state and how these risks are mitigated and exacerbated by the built environment and how this impacts human health. In our second seminar, we introduced the concepts of climate adaptation and community resilience, focusing on sustainability targets, policy coordination, innovation and technology, electrification and decarbonization, resilience hubs, and social equity, among other topics. The climate action involved changing physical infrastructure, adapting policies, practices, systems, and building resilience to improve a community's capacity to recover from and adapt to climate change and emergencies. We are excited to continue this conversation with our fantastic slate of panelists that we have organized for you today. One housekeeping item, we'll have time for audience Q&A at the end of the session, so please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's program. David Eisenman is professor in residence at the David Geffen School of Medicine and the Fielding School of Public Health at UCLA, where he is the director of the Center for Public Health and Disasters. He is also the deputy director for community partnerships at UCLA Center for Healthy Climate Solutions. Dr. Eisenman's training is in internal medicine, primary care, public health, and health services research. His research is focused on public health and disasters, including wildfires, heat waves, COVID-19, climate change, and violence. Dr. Eisenman holds a board certification in internal medicine, and he cares for patients at the UCLA Medical Center. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Eisenman.
All right, well, good morning. Thank you, Tim, for the introduction. Today's topic on managed retreat and displacement is really fascinating to me. We're going to be talking today about learning how communities are dealing with climate threats and solutions and how those changes are driving choices in the community. And this is not something I've done a lot of research on specifically, so I had to do a little homework. And what I've done is I want to frame it through the topic of internally displaced populations, which is research I have done in my research on evacuation from Katrina and Hurricane Sandy, and looking at Chico and Paradise, the campfires there. Internally displaced populations, of course, being people who are forced to leave their homes due to avoiding harms. And, early on in a disaster, that can be in the form of a pre-event message and people evacuate. But then after the disaster, it's actually that their homes are destroyed and they may have to live in shelters or FEMA housing in the United States for a year or more. And it's interesting, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center 2021 Global Report reported that there are 1.7 million persons in the US who were newly displaced from disasters in 2020, mostly from weather and climate related events. And that's really astounding to me. That's more than, the US was the fifth most internally displaced persons behind China, India, the Philippines, and Bangladesh in 2020. More than 1 million of those persons were from wildfires. So this is really relevant to the West in particular. But of course, a lot of that was from also from hurricanes on the East Coast. So it's relevant nationally. And while many of them are people who have just had to evacuate and get back and then come back to their homes, many of them never do. And as we'll hear from our speaker from Paradise, from Chico, and regarding the Paradise campfires, years after those fires, less than 1,000 of the 9,000 homes that were destroyed have been rebuilt. So this rebuilding could take a while. It also drives home some myths versus facts sort of topics. We think in climate change about we hear about people being driven across international borders in climate change, how that's going to be the new future. And we're supposed to be thinking about big events doing that. Well, it turns out that actually most disaster displacement is very small and localized into small communities, less than 100 persons at a time. And that these smaller events that affect less than 100 persons at a time are actually 50% of the displacing events in the country and in the world. So the kinds of small, localized conversations we're having today are entirely relevant. Last thing in terms of myths and facts, we also think we'll hear about managed retreat today, which is the idea that communities can prevent and prepare for disasters by actually planning to move away from the hazard in advance. And we hear about this in the context of the Pacific Islands, Fiji, Vanuatu. Actually, as we'll hear today, there are many communities in the US that have been identified that are planning relocation. So all these global climate change induced events are really very relevant to the United States and California. So we'll be hearing today about managed retreat. We'll be hearing about the campfire in paradise, and we'll be hearing about Pacoima Beautiful, a case study in climate gentrification and displacement avoidance that is being done by the grant from the Transformative Climate Communities. Our speakers today are Jessica Bremner, a consultant for concrete design and a PhD candidate at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Health. Jessica is an urban planning consultant. Entering the PhD program at UCLA, Jessica was the planning director of Concrete Design Initiative, a nonprofit community development and design firm based in LA and in Nairobi, Kenya. Her research examines the intersections of spatial justice, gender, housing, participatory practices, and democracy. Her projects have been featured in the New York Times and exhibited at the Louisiana Art Museum in Copenhagen and the Smithsonian Cooper Hewitt in New York. We'll be hearing from Dan Efsieff, who is district manager at the Paradise Recreation and Park District. Dan is an environmental professional with extensive experience with park and agency leadership, river conservation in California, especially riparian ecology and restoration. He is currently the district manager for the Paradise Recreation and Park District, and previously was the Park and Natural Resource Manager for the city of Chico. And apparently he's also a sea kayak instructor and operates a kayaking outfit in Northern California, which I'm going to look up after this event. We will be hearing from Liz Kozlov. Liz is an assistant professor in the Department of Urban Planning and the Institute of Environment and Sustainability at UCLA, with a joint appointment in sociology. Her research and teaching interests include environmental and climate justice. She's currently writing a book called Retreat: Moving to Higher Ground in a Climate Change City, that offers an on-the-ground look at the home buyout processes in New York City after Hurricane Sandy. Finally, we'll be hearing from Ryan Luster. Ryan is a senior project director at the Nature Conservancy. Ryan holds degrees from Beloit College and Utah State University, a master's in science and range science, and has worked in the natural resource management field since 1994. In his role as senior project director at the Nature Conservancy, Ryan works closely with state, federal, and nonprofit partners to advance floodplain and freshwater conservation, groundwater management, and habitat restoration. So we will begin now our first round with opening remarks, 10 minutes from each panelist. And I'm going to turn the spotlight over to Professor Liz Kozlov.
Thank you so much, David, and just enormous thanks to Lynn and Christina and Tim for organizing this series and inviting me to participate. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. All right, I think my slides are coming up. I should say my internet is a little bit dicey, so hopefully it will sustain itself long enough for me to get through this presentation. If you hear any unusual sounds in the background, that's just my toddler. So please don't be alarmed if there's sudden screaming. Hopefully there will not be. So I was asked to start out by giving a bit of background on managed retreat, what it is, what policies make it possible, and some of the challenges for communities that are confronting the decision of whether to stay put or retreat in the face of disasters and climate change. Next slide, please. So what is managed retreat? The term managed retreat, which I thought was pretty dystopian sounding the first time I heard it, from what I understand, actually comes from the realm of coastal ecology and management, where it initially referred to managing the retreat of coastlines themselves. So in other words, when a shoreline shifts inland due to erosion or sea level rise, one option is to manage that retreat rather than trying to prevent it. So this might entail removing hard coastal defenses or infrastructure, like the road you can see here, that's blocking the movement of the shore, opening up space for the natural migration of wetlands and other coastal species and habitats that might otherwise be blocked or squeezed out of existence. Next slide. More recently, managed retreat has come to refer to the movement of people away from environmental hazards, as David pointed out. And I often define retreat as the process of relocating people, unbuilding or clearing land, and at least in theory, restoring habitat in places exposed to flooding, sea level rise, and other effects of climate change. But while it's relatively easy to move a physical structure, like a road, or as you can see in this drawing of a house picking up and running that headed an op-ed published shortly after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, it's much harder to relocate communities and to sustain cultures and social ties, which are integral to health and to climate change resilience. Next slide. It's probably no surprise that retreat is highly controversial in all manner of contexts. Even just broaching the idea of planning for possible retreat at some point in the future can be a non-starter, as in the Southern California city of Del Mar, which has been in a standoff with the State Coastal Commission over the commission's urging that coastal cities address retreat as a potential response to sea level rise. So in cities and property markets long premised on growth, retreat and retreat planning are perceived as a threat, and are a threat to property values, property rights, and to the tax base that allows many local governments to sustain themselves, to sustain their infrastructure and services, including climate adaptation, for the broader community. And there's lots of political power in wealthier, more privileged communities to ward off the possibility of retreat. Places like this have long benefited and are likely to continue to benefit from investments of public resources that enable them to remain in place and minimize the risks that accompany residents in dangerous but desirable locales. For instance, you might have read Mike Davis's classic piece, The Case for Letting Malibu Burn. Next slide, please. For marginalized communities, conversely, many of whom live in places made all the more hazardous through pollution, extraction, and disinvestment, retreat can represent a new chapter in an ongoing story of environmental injustice and racialized dispossession. In New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, the local newspaper reported that some planners and officials were proposing to, quote unquote, shrink the footprint of the city by converting predominantly Black neighborhoods to parkland, rather than allowing them to be rebuilt, while white neighborhoods that suffered similar flooding apparently faced no such plan. And although this vision didn't come to pass after fierce opposition from residents and community leaders, the patterns of post-storm rebuilding and property demolition in that city, including of demolition of undamaged public housing, nonetheless meant that it was disproportionately Black residents and low-income residents who were displaced and remained unable to return to their homes after the storm, left with few options or resources but to retreat. Next slide. Given that these stories of resistance to retreat are the norm, in my own research, I'm working to understand what leads a community to come together and embrace retreat, and what are the consequences when they do. And I began asking these questions after Hurricane Sandy, which struck the Northeast US when I was a PhD student at NYU. Attending community meetings in New York City after the storm, to my surprise, I saw homeowners along Staten Island's east and south shores organizing and lobbying the government to buy them out, asking for their homes and neighborhoods to be demolished and permanently returned to natural open space. Next slide. Here are just a couple of pictures that I took during my field work as I followed these groups of residents for 4 years following the storm. As some of them received support and funding to retreat and others did not. You can see one of the signs in this picture reads, "Governor Cuomo, Mother Nature wants her land back. Buy us out and give it back." This is a man wrote this. He put signs all around his house asking for buyouts, asking to retreat. Next slide. In the US, home buyouts are the primary means of retreat, at least for now. So the program that wound up being created at the behest of homeowners after Hurricane Sandy was typical in being 75% federally funded with a 25% local match, that in this case was New York State. Most federal buyout funding comes from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and to a lesser extent, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and sometimes on a smaller scale, other agencies like the Department of Agriculture. Next slide. Buyout programs are almost always reactive rather than proactive. So they tend to require a disaster declaration in order to receive funding. And although retreat is often talked about in the future tense as some far off possibility and last resort when it comes to climate adaptation, in reality, more than 43,000 buyouts have already taken place nationwide through FEMA alone. This is a map of just kind of how much of the US they have covered. They've occurred in 49 of 50 states and more than 1,000 counties. They're usually pretty small scale, but they're extensive. And in almost all cases, they've been in response to flooding rather than hazards like wildfires. And a big open question is what it means to retreat in the context of different types of disasters or in anticipation in advance of a more slow-moving phenomenon like sea level rise. Next slide. So buyouts are legally voluntary at this point, but for many homeowners I spent time with in Staten Island, they seemed like a good deal and a good deal for a good cause, giving land back to Mother Nature to help protect the broader community from flooding and to save taxpayers at large the costs of future disaster aid and flood insurance claims. New York State's program paid full pre-storm fair market value, as is pretty typical of these programs, plus a set of bonus incentives. So people who participated got 5% extra for relocating somewhere else within New York City, and 10% extra was given to property owners in areas that expressed a strong collective willingness to move. As a growing number of communities reckon with more severe, costly disasters and inadequate resources to protect themselves, conversations about retreat are becoming more necessary. And demands like those I observed in Staten Island are likely to spread, raising questions about what happens over the longer term to the people who move, to those who stay behind or do not receive such support, and to the places that people leave, as well as the places where they wind up. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're now going to turn to Jessica Bremner and her presentation.
Hi, thank you all. Good morning or almost good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be able to present a project that we did in collaboration here at UCLA in urban planning with the community organization Pacoima Beautiful. That really, in contrast to what Liz was just talking about, is about how do we avoid displacement when we're actually investing in addressing climate change? So you can go to the next slide. So over the last few years, California has implemented over $10.5 billion in cap and trade funds through California climate investments that have been used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and delivering major economic, environmental, and public health benefits. Next slide. And these are implemented through over 70 programs administered by more than 20 state agencies. And they're putting these funds to use through 3 priority areas. So through transportation and sustainable communities, clean energy and energy efficiency, and natural resources and water diversion. And one of the big equity questions from this investment is about who benefits from these investments and how do we avoid negative externalities from these investments. Next slide. So one program that is addressing this question is the Transformative Climate Communities program run by the Strategic Growth Council. And this program has awarded over $230 million in implementation and planning grants to 26 communities throughout California, and is specifically addressing infrastructure projects in California's most disadvantaged communities. It's currently on its fourth round of funding this year. Next slide. The program requires projects to have 6 transformative elements, and one of these is around displacement avoidance. So they ask all projects to assess whether eligible plans and the infrastructure projects can and will avoid economic displacement of residents and businesses. And in the first 2 rounds of the TCC grant, projects were not funded through TCC. Rather, they were required to use leveraged funds for displacement avoidance plans. In rounds 3 and 4, they have since started to fund the displacement avoidance plans, and they can use up to 3% of community engagement funds for displacement avoidance activities. Next slide. So when we talk about displacement, we're really talking about households who are forced to move from or are prevented from moving to areas because of conditions that are really out of their control. And often this results from gentrification in neighborhoods that become financially out of reach for people through investments or through earlier disinvestment. Next slide. So in the second round of the TCC here in Los Angeles in the neighborhood of Pacoima and Sun Valley, the Green Together Collaborative was awarded $23 million for green infrastructure projects. Next slide. And this Green Together Collaborative brings together nonprofits, private companies, as well as government agencies from throughout LA, and is led by the community organization Pacoima Beautiful, who has worked on environmental justice issues in the neighborhood of Pacoima in the Northeast San Fernando Valley for decades. Next slide. The project has 14 projects. 7 of them are funded through TCC, and they're around mobility improvements, solar energy, and urban greening. And then there's 7 leveraged projects that focus on flood control, household heat reduction, and new transit oriented development. Next slide. So they were awarded over $23 million from the Transformative Climate Communities, and then leveraged an additional $47 million in projects. However, $0 from TCC were used for the displacement avoidance plan. Next slide. And the displacement avoidance plan for the project addresses kind of 5 major pieces. So really around affordable housing, looking at policies for community land trusts and accessory dwelling units, as well as implementing different tasks for tenant protection, increasing small business assistance, and supporting alternative types of business models. Next slide. And UCLA has partnered on the TCC project since the beginning, so particularly with the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, as well as the Luskin Center for Innovation. And because of the lack of funding with the displacement avoidance plan, UCLA Luskin Urban Planning was brought on as a collaborator in 2019. Next slide. And this collaboration leveraged an already established program of the development. So for the Masters of Urban and Regional Planning, students are required to complete a comprehensive project. And so we combined this student research project with the need to work on the displacement avoidance plan through 2 different comprehensive projects in 2019 and 2021. And this was led by Professor Vineet Mukherjee from the Department of Urban Planning and supported by myself and Sylvia Gonzalez, formerly from the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, and now the research director at the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. And this was both a community and student engaged research project. And we received funding from an additional UCLA initiative, the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, to help with the research in 2021 around business displacement avoidance. Next slide. In 2019, our research project really focused on the policy and tasks of the displacement avoidance plan concerning affordable housing. Next slide. And in 2021, we built on that research to continue looking at policies for accessory dwelling units and expanded it to look at business displacement avoidance. Next slide. So 2019 really focused on accessory dwelling units and community land trusts as possible avenues for displacement avoidance. And we were really trying to assist in exploring what the landscape of accessory dwelling units were in Pacoima, what the experience of tenants living in those units are, and what the experience of homeowners are in building and improving those units. And for community land trusts, we were looking at what models might work in the Pacoima context. Next slide. So we surveyed the grant area of both Pacoima and Sun Valley. Next slide. And we found that over 48% of properties had an ADU on them already. And not only did they have an ADU, these ADUs were found in very different configurations that we normally think of. So it's not just the garage unit, but there were attached units to households, there were divisions within households, and there weren't just one ADU on a property. There were multiple. At times, we even found that there were 4 ADUs on a single property. Next slide. We also found that 44% of people living in ADUs were family members, and another additional 18% living in ADUs were friends. And so really, these were relationships between main unit homeowners and ADU tenants. And what that resulted in, next slide, is that a majority of tenants actually don't have formal leases in these ADUs. And they also consider these ADUs to be temporary. So where we thought that that ADUs really result in permanent housing situations for residents that live in ADUs actually consider them to be temporary, even if they've been in these units for a decade or more. Next slide. We also found that there were a number of financial challenges with constructing and improving ADUs in Pacoima. So homeowners, for the most part, lack access to financial products like loans or mortgages, and as a result, have to use personal savings for any ADU improvements that they do, and oftentimes for even the initial ADU construction. Next slide. Through our research, we also found that although there are a number of successful community land trusts throughout Los Angeles, they weren't really appropriate for the context of Pacoima, considering the number of single-family homes in the area, as well as the ownership tenant relationships. And so we explored a scattered site community land trusts through an alternative model where Pacoima Beautiful would be the owner or leasee of a property. And we found that 88% of respondents were interested in leasing to the community organization. Sorry, Lynn, I just saw your chat. You can just go to the last slide. So what we found was that the displacement avoidance policies that the TCC kind of recommends actually isn't really contextual to Pacoima, and that it takes a lot longer and requires more funding as well as more and different policy changes than really fits into the Transformative Climate Communities grant. And in addition, while it's really great that these grants are looking at displacement avoidance and are focused on disadvantaged communities, These are under-resourced communities that have a limited capacity to apply, manage, and meet leveraged fund reporting and governance requirements. So yeah, I'll wrap up there and finish some other questions later.
Okay, well, thank you, Jessica. Yes, you have a lot to say, and I think we have so much to cover that we will certainly, but in a short time in the beginning, that we'll certainly get to some of this material during the moderated discussion period. And next, we're going to turn to Ryan Luster, please.
Actually, now it's afternoon. Afternoon, everyone. Hi, my name is Ryan Luster, and with the Nature Conservancy in California, and I am based in Chico. I'm here today with Dan Asseth of the Paradise Recreation and Parks District to discuss work we are partnering on in the post-2018 campfire landscape around the town of Paradise, California. I'll be providing a rather high-level intro to our partnership, while Dan will dig into details following me in a moment. After wildfires occur, many policy and funding paradigms in California put pressure on communities like Paradise to rebuild in place, pushing to get things back to normal, quote unquote, potentially putting people at risk of future wildfires. Instead, with proactive pre and post disaster planning, there is an opportunity to build real resilience in communities like Paradise, in communities across California, using nature to protect people from future risk of wildfires and other natural disasters. Thinking beyond traditional fireproofing methods, TNC is exploring the opportunity for nature-based community-scale approaches to fire resilience, such as establishing buffers, which is open space between the likely sources of wildfires and the denser urban communities, which may reduce the fuel load and limit the spread of wildfires, ultimately protecting communities from wildland fires. These wildfire risk reduction buffer zones are what we're calling resilience parks. Resilience parks can also provide staging areas for first responders and community members. In addition, they can serve as shelter-in-place areas during a fire when evacuation is impeded. In addition to mitigating the impacts of natural disasters, the multi-benefit resilience parks will also allow communities to enjoy the benefits open spaces provide, such as offering recreation opportunities and conservation benefits. As Paradise's long-term recovery plan from the 2018 campfire begins to take shape, TNC is partnering with the Paradise Recreation and Parks District to investigate the feasibility of establishing these resilience parks as part of a community-scale risk reduction plan, creating a green belt around the town that may serve as a protective buffer between people and the wildlands for future fires. As a landowner across the large swath of Butte County that was affected by the campfire, Paradise Recreation and Parks District was the first entity to consider the idea of repurposing burnt properties for resilience parks, and is well positioned to play a leading role in creating new approaches to land management that will reduce the long-term risk of fire while providing exciting conservation and recreation opportunities. The Parks District will execute transactions necessary to acquire these properties to create the resilience parks. It will protect those lands, manage them, and provide long-term stewardship. But first, to determine the ideal placement and size for resilience parks in Paradise, TNC invested in a technical analysis led by the Conservation Biology Institute to help the Parks District prioritize which parcels to focus on. The locations considered are lots that were formerly developed and impacted by the 2018 campfire. And the highest priority parcels maximize both risk reduction and conservation values simultaneously. The goal is to turn these areas into a connected network of parks that provide fire risk reduction, recreation, and habitat conservation. Now, looking beyond Paradise, the ultimate goal is to develop a replicable model of nature-based wildfire risk reduction and showcase the protective benefits that resilience parks may provide to communities. By demonstrating that open space protection may be a tool for community risk reduction in Paradise, we can effectively make the case to state and federal agencies and legislators that incentives and funding for disaster mitigation and response can and should align with conservation and recreation goals. Doing so may result in more fire resilient communities throughout California and allow managers to proactively plan ahead for future impacts of climate change. And now I will turn it over to Dan.
Thanks, Ryan. I'm just going to bring up a shared screen here in a moment. Just wanted to cover a few things regarding our efforts here. I think I'm very honored to be here today. It's been an interesting opportunity to learn from some of the other folks on this panel. And also, I think it represents a very much an interdisciplinary approach to handle this. As a society, we're not well equipped to yet tackle these unprecedented wildfire events that have been with us. California has suffered its top 10 largest wildfires have been in this century. So over the last 22 years have been the greatest fires, and certainly over the last few years have been even more so than ever. So this gives us a chance to kind of challenge those paradigms, I think, and share with you some of the options here. I'll go through some of the genesis of this project, and then also what some of the benefits could be from it, from a climate adaptation standpoint, water quality, air quality, and then sustainable economic development utilizing nature-based approaches. I really feel like what we learned here in Paradise and how to live with fire-adapted approaches are lessons for the rest of California and the West. So it's very important for us. Just a brief mentioning of the Camp Fire. One of the things I think is somehow forgotten is each one of these dots represents a family that was displaced or more in many cases. So these are a map of the structures lost in the fire. Not all the structures were recorded on this. And so there's areas that were poor houses that weren't even on the county records where people were living in. But you can see the concentration of it throughout Paradise here. And the speed of it. The community lost approximately 20,000 structures, most of those in the first 4 to 6 hours. Our district is 172 square miles of Sierra Nevada and Cascade foothills. And the footprint of the Camp Fire is essentially contained, or the district is contained within the footprint of the Camp Fire. Give you a sense of the scale here, this would be equivalent of the anchor points of UCLA on one end and Anaheim or Disneyland on the other. So to give you a sense of the area that was covered that day. There was a pretty immense response from fire and fire crews on that day, and tremendous loss, upwards of $16 billion in structural losses, 85 lives from the event. There may be many more lives from the air quality issues that came afterward. And the fire response itself was upwards of 150 million in the 28-day operation period, and certainly more following the recovery. One of the things I'll just touch on real briefly is that our scale of wildfires are unprecedented and demands a new approach. And so one thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is the idea of the fire behavior triangle. Day of the Camp Fire, temperatures were pretty modest, a high of 72, slightly higher than average for that time of year, a low relative humidity, and fuel moisture that we'll probably experience several times this year throughout California with the ongoing drought. Fuel moisture maintained a low level starting late spring and didn't change until well into winter of 2018, 2019. The wind was a big driver as well. So we have a predicted 20 miles per hour with a 40-mile-an-hour gust, and then that rose up to 52-mile-an-hour recorded at near the fire, basically hurricane force winds. So what is interesting to a lot of folks is these are not, they're unusual, but not unprecedented. There were other opportunities for those types of fires to propagate and spread quickly. Topography is interesting in Paradise. So we're sitting on basically a little tilted volcanic plateau with deep incised canyons. This gets to some of the challenges of firefighting in the area, but also provides some opportunities if we can create some buffers around the community. And this was kind of a driver from much of this idea. Our fuels throughout the area are variable. Lots of different habitats, as much of California as shares, and different fuels that have been built up over time because of suppression in our Mediterranean climate. Things just do not decay quickly over time. There's also fuels related to our built infrastructure. So even though you may have a building that has good defensible space, the fuels and catching a fire of buildings next door propagated this throughout the community. I like to think of that fire behavior triangle as having that built environment component to it, patterns on how we develop, where, composition, how those areas integrate with wildland areas are very important on the safety of the community. And I think this gets back to our changing of scale. So oftentimes people think of building codes as being a solution, and certainly there were buildings up to code or exceeding fire code with good defensible space, and yet they burned during the campfire. So I think we need to look at a whole other scale, and it was very influential in how we thought about creating these buffers around the community to protect it. I think there's some good analogies here with coastal communities, as was mentioned before, floodplains, that there's some areas that we need to give nature a bit more room. And so that this is a concept I think that it could be applied here. It's just new to, I think, a lot of people's thinking on their running through their head as far as like how fire behaves across the landscape. Our scale is very common for homes to have defensible space around it. That's expanded over time and what people think is safe. But we're really talking about a defensible space around communities. And Ryan mentioned the importance of this kind of nature-based component for us to have multiple benefits, for us to have healthy communities that are getting out and recreating and enjoying these areas, having fuels crews that can manage it, access for fire crews, and providing protection for vulnerable natural communities in our area. It's important that we give nature some room and it's managed well. A couple of quick concepts here. Hillsides with that steep area is going to be much more prone to homes catching on fire. Paradise had an inordinate amount of homes on that top third of slope and also up on top, as many areas of California. These are nice views, but yet they were very vulnerable and in some cases kind of create a fuse into the community. The lower diagram here shows an overhead view of distribution of homes. The one on the left is very similar to what was a lot of Paradise. So it was kind of dispersed. Traditionally, the thinking was that these homes were spaced out to where any individual home caught fire, there'd be enough room around it to contain it. But these fires are on a different scale. So the one on the right has a much more defensible area that can pull resources, have homes that are built around, that they're sharing defensible space. And there's also a benefit to communities in that they're providing ease of services and more economical scales to be successful on serving these communities. Another important lesson for us was you might have woken up day of the campfire, 6:30, thinking parks make life better. By 10:45, realize that parks can save lives. The structure here, this is at Billy Park. This is 2 days after the fire. You can see it looks like just a cloudy day, but that's smoke in the background, still a fire going in different areas, had passed through Paradise. many hours before. And yet this was an area that was very defensible, served as an impromptu refugia for over 100 people that chose this as their strategic location to wait out until they could safely be evacuated. The building, fortunately, was oriented in such a way to where the cinder block aspect of it blocked the wind and the ember blizzard that was going across the parking lot and through the park. And they knew that this area was managed well. Fuels were lifted up. There wasn't a whole lot of fuels on the ground. It had green grass around it. And so this is a very wise choice for many people that ended up losing their homes that day. This design is really important for us on how we move forward. This picture, by the way, is a 120-degree view, standing in the same location, showing the park on one side and a part of the wildland area. And up on that ridge were probably 3 or 4 homes that were consumed in the fire. So just to give a sense of how this might work, this is a kind of a 1950s flatland view of what the area was like. Maximized residential lots. It helps with your marketing for folks that may be retiring from the Bay Area or other urban areas. Mountainous land that has abundance of property and next door to the river. We now know that area, steep canyons, are challenging. This is the same area with the topography overlaid on it. The roads were often not connected, and you had long traverses for people to evacuate or fire crews to come in. This is a road. This is a road on the eastern edge of Paradise that fire engines would not go down. And so because there's not a way to turn around once you got in there. So we know today these are high-risk areas. This isn't theoretical. The homes in this area were in excess of 95% lost. That's those red dots on here, with only a few homes that survive. So what this might look like if this area is managed is a few things. We would connect the roads, we'd create some trails for fuels and access during fire events, and then have we do not call it managed retreat here. We're tend to put it in terms of the positive, that this is an asset to the community, providing multiple benefits for recreation and enjoyment of views and fuels management. Ryan mentioned our partnership. This has been absolutely critical for us. Our district had lost about 60% of our staff. We needed resources and help in areas that we didn't have expertise in prior to the campfire. And so TNC and many other partners have been instrumental in us taking this idea to the next level. Science is important on this to demonstrate to the agencies that this has merit. One of the ideas was to look at the feasibility, the viability of this, reduces the relative fire risk, but also, interestingly enough, has been additional efforts from insurance companies and other institutes that have taken our modeling, seen what that means from a fire protection standpoint. This scenario here, in a completely different exercise separate from us, resulted in a reduction of 40% of premiums. I just have a few moments here, so I want to go through a couple of things that our bottom line approach. We want to reintroduce good fire onto this landscape. Us as an agency, we're Parks and Rec District, that we don't have a say in land use planning and some of these other efforts. Those will catch up over time, but we can provide a bit more of a vision here that's providing parks and recreation. This is something I think we'll get to in the chat, but we're one of the fastest growing communities in California. One thing that drives us, propels our vision, is the idea of what do we look like in the future? And so this has been a very positive effort for the community in sharing with us what their visions are. And so what we've been able to do is leverage some of these visioning ideas into parks and ideas and engagement with community, not only from the fire protection standpoint, which seems to resonate quite well, but also what do they want as a community? This is an area that has very low economic opportunities, as do many communities in Sierra Nevadas. And there's also that idea of recreation providing a destination, which in turn helps economic development in a sustainable way, and also helps the health and well-being of our communities that do not have access to a lot of areas. I want to touch on just one quick project. This is Lake Ridge. It's on a steep hillside overlooking McGilly Reservoir. It is, for many intents and purposes, a microcosm of this larger buffer vision. Have a steep hillside that we manage for shaded forest, fuel break, and then as it wraps up on top, you have areas that are fields, hardened structures, and also that's given us the opportunity to work with adjoining landowner who now wants to provide, may provide in the near future, multifamily housing, which has been essentially difficult in an unincorporated area of rural Butte County to provide. And so this could be very much a flagship project that is providing not only parks and recreation, vendors on site that are providing refreshments, coffee, donuts, healthy snacks, all of that tied in with a 20-mile loop trail. But we've also taken to heart some of the lessons on design. And so that field, for example, it is going to be used for soccer or baseball 40,000 days every 10 years, also can be used as a staging area and refugia for at least 120 cars and many more people potentially in that area. In finishing up, and I know that we are short on time, but I just wanted to give a shout out to the Nature Conservancy and some of our other partners, because without this, we could not move forward with these projects. And it's been very valuable for us to move it ahead. And I think it's opened up some eyes at the agency levels on what a potential vision and solution could be for a community such as Paradise. So we're very excited about what happens next.
Okay, thank you. I think at this point, Ryan, do you want to step in for a moment and talk a little bit about the TNC partnership? And then we'll go on to moderated questions.
Sure. Essentially, as I talked a little bit about in my opening remarks, and what Dan has also talked about, was we're developing this model that hopefully can be replicated across very similar communities in the Sierra Nevada foothills and other high-risk fire-prone areas in California, and taking the lessons that we're learning by working in Paradise to extend to these communities. Now we know that obviously what we've been talking about today is we're working in a post-fire landscape in Paradise, but we believe that developing these buffer park areas can be translated into a pre-disaster context. So just want to keep that in mind, that again, even though we're working post-fire, that everything that we're trying to demonstrate and learn through the work that we're doing in Paradise, it really is intended as a pre-disaster type of methodology that can be extended elsewhere. Knowing that most of these, a lot of these communities that are in high fire risk areas throughout California are small and typically don't have a lot of resources. What we're really trying to do is bring resources, help bring resources to Paradise. And so as we talked about, we funded this initial study with Conservation Biology Institute to map out where would the best placement be for these multi-purpose park areas around Paradise and the other communities that are in the campfire footprint. And also knowing that, the entities that are responsible for managing these areas, whether it's the town of Paradise itself, or the Paradise Recreation and Park District where Dan works, as Dan mentioned, they are under understaffed. And so a direct example of what we are doing is providing funding to Paradise Recreation Park District. And they've brought on a contractor who is actually doing the real estate work to go out, talk to landowners, see who's interested in willingly selling their properties to the Parks and Recreation District to build out these buffer areas. So that's one example of how we're trying to support local institutions while they catch up, and then help them tap into these larger sources of funding, funding from FEMA, funding from Cal OES, different state and federal programs. So that's really quite frankly, the bottom line of our partnership is providing that funding to help them bring up their resources so they can tap into larger pots of resources.
One thing I was going to share on the image I showed with the Lake Ridge Park project is that's been funded. The state of California has invested $5.2 million, and in addition to a $500,000 grant for a 20-mile trail loop system. These are traditional park sources, and yet a direct benefit will be access to wildland areas for fire crews and an evacuation area on it. So I think there's multiple benefits that we have incorporated in our projects, certainly with the leveraging of funds from TNC's support. I'll also mention that we have a program it should be approved within days, hopefully here, is a new program from FEMA, relatively new program, Building Resiliency in Communities, which has some more flexibility on looking at solutions. And we're going to take that study and look at next level, provide a framework for us to move forward with these transactions, which since I've been here, we've done at least half a dozen acquisitions already. And there's more to come, I think, on moving forward with this.
Well, I'm going to turn to some questions for the panel. And then after that, open it up to questions from the audience, which we're starting to get. And I just remind the audience to type in questions into the Q&A, please. So, the panel has generally been talking about community level impacts and community responses that you have been part of that are both responses to threats as well as solutions. And so I'm interested in how do these decisions to prepare for climate threats, to relocate or to rebuild, play out in people's lived experiences. And I'll start with Liz on this one. She talked about the effect on cultural and societal ties and on well-being of individuals. I'd like to hear more about that.
I'm sorry, my internet cut off during the second part of the question after lived experiences.
Yeah, it'd be great if you could tell us a little bit about how people experience this in terms of their cultural, social ties, their effects on well-being, be it health, economic, and other forms of well-being.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So, I think when I was doing my research, it became really clear to me, and I think this is probably true in contexts other than Staten Island, although that's where, I've done the most on the ground research, is it's really important to understand how people and why people came to be in a particular place in the first instance, to understand what it means for them to leave or potentially to retreat. And in Staten Island, for many of the people who had lived there, these neighborhoods were multi-generational, a lot of extended family ties, people living close together. So they seemed they were very deeply rooted, but they primarily moved there. Most of the people I spoke to had come because it was a place they could afford to buy a house. It wasn't necessarily proximity to the water or the beach that had drawn people there. These were no longer working waterfronts, very different than many coastal communities. And for many people I spoke to, the kind of identity that was important for them to sustain and kind of security that was important for them had to do with staying a homeowner and, getting bought out and being able to move somewhere else. It was less important, I think, for many people where they wound up moving, as opposed to kind of staying nearby. And I think Staten Island is large enough and has enough high elevation land that many people were able to move very short distances and to stay nearby. And there was a strong kind of borough-wide identity in a way that in other parts of New York City, like in the Rockaway Peninsula, places where it felt like you could move a short distance and really be uprooted from the kind of community and culture that you identified with, that I didn't see as much being the case in Staten Island. And some people did disperse more broadly, but I think that was kind of something that stuck with me about the experience there. And it's very, very different, in many other communities. In Staten Island, it was predominantly white homeowners, working class homeowners. They were not anticipating facing housing discrimination, for instance, in other places. Retreat for them was not a matter of kind of cultural survival versus forced assimilation, as in many tribal communities that are facing these kinds of decisions. So, really different meaning depending on the place that you're in.
Okay. Dan, Ryan, maybe you can weigh in on this too, based on the experience up in Paradise and those communities.
This is more anecdotal than data. There's really good information about the distribution and how people immediately after the campfire moved. Many of them moved close by to Chico, Oroville, other nearby communities. I mentioned that we had unfortunately lost about 60% of our staff post-campfire because they had to move upwards of 2 hours away out of state, moving with family members. And so it was interesting. I think most of the time we think of people after post-disaster, they're moving to FEMA housing nearby, but really what was going on is people were loading up with other individuals and their friends and family. And so that was the initial response. The other thing that's been interesting for me in this buffer project is been the receptivity of the community to it. So one of the first acquisitions that we did with Sierra Nevada Conservancy funding to add to one of our parks was a landowner next door that had 9 acres, had a small wetland on it, which is unusual for Paradise, and approached us with the idea of, look, I got an offer yesterday from someone that wanted to subdivide and create more housing on this property. I'm not moving back. I couldn't see doing that to my community. Have you guys thought about this as a park? So it was validating to hear this this is early on in the process, validating to hear this from a landowner who had worked through the logic of it and concluded that the best disposition of their property would be a park addition for their community rather than more housing that could be at risk. So I think there's a lot of support for this concept. We had an open house with the town of Paradise that we participated in a couple of days ago, had at least 30 or 40 members of the public walk through. And the traditional workshop where you have the green dots or the red dots that you're posting on there, unanimous. I think it's hard to find any community that's unanimous about a concept, but had 30 or 40 dots on the positive on this. And some of the comments were, this makes so much sense. Why hasn't this been done before? And we're in an area that has exceedingly strong private property rights, yet they view this as an asset for the community that helps protect private property throughout. So I think there's some many other ways to go there, but I'm just kind of curious what other panel members may have to say on this.
I just add a different perspective of the results of the fire. So Dan and I both live in Chico, which is about 15 minutes, depending on how fast you drive, from Paradise. And a lot of people live in Paradise, but they work in Chico. And vice versa, a lot of people who live in Chico can sometimes go up and work in Paradise. But with the destruction of the town, as we described in a matter of 6 hours, all of a sudden we had 25,000 people relocated into Chico, which was at the time a city of 90,000 people. So you can imagine increasing the population of Chico by 30% in a matter of hours, the chaos that ensued. And there's a lot of and that the impacts were felt all over the place, from the wastewater system being overtaxed, to police not being able to respond in time to calls, to schools now being filled to the brim with all the children that had to come down. When we think about disasters and people who have been displaced from the community that's been impacted, we also need to be thinking about the communities where those people go to, and how those communities are also impacted as the receiving end of all those impacts. So it was difficult on both ends for sure.
Let me ask a question to Jessica. We know that the solutions, as you described, can be potentially a displacing force, but they're clearly an important part of ensuring that our communities are adapted to climate change. So, going forward from your work, what lessons have you learned about how we can craft adaptation solutions, adaptation incentives, adaptation policies that support communities, support local businesses to mitigate against displacement, as you're trying to do in Pacoima?
Yeah. So, I think one is, and I touched on this a little bit, is that there just really isn't enough funding for actual displacement avoidance plans. So we're spending a lot of funding on the actual infrastructure and a very small percentage of funding on the policies, advocating for the policies, or for creating new programs that are non-governmental for supporting displacement avoidance. And a lot of that work is being put on the communities themselves and not being taken on by government agencies. I would also, one of the things that we found in Pacoima is that displacement is actually happening before investment. We know that in California, throughout California, we have a housing crisis. And that housing crisis is causing displacement in our metropolitan areas at a faster rate than these investments are even coming. And so what we're seeing then is that the investments aren't actually going to be going to the communities that they're meant to be going to. They're going to be addressing and adapting the environment for communities that are wealthier, because the disadvantaged communities that were there before are no longer there. And a lot of these programs and policies and solutions are especially at the household level, geared towards homeowners. So renters in general are not seeing the benefits of, alternative energy. They're not seeing the benefits of heat reduction in their households, because homeowners are not making those changes for their tenants. So there's also a whole disparity on the household level. So we need more programs and policies that are addressed towards tenants and incentivizing improvements at the household level for rental properties, especially.
Okay. Well, I'm going to actually turn now to some of the audience questions, because we really are getting some really great questions here, and I want to give people time to have their questions answered. And one that jumps out at me first is from Madeline Glickfield to Professor Kozlov. She asks, is the difference between the Del Mar reaction and the Staten Island community based mainly on socioeconomic status, or are there attitudinal issues that are main drivers of their willingness or reluctance to do managed retreat? And I think you touched on this, but I think there is this question of what is going on between, what are the incentives that lead communities to take one route or the other?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Madeline, for that question. It's a good question. Again, as an ethnographer, I've really been, embedded in the Staten Island context. I haven't talked to people on the ground in Del Mar. There's a fantastic PhD student in sociology who is doing some work there, Andrew Malmuth. And so, I'm looking forward to kind of follow his work over the next few years. But I think, what I would say are some of the salient differences have to do with, again, that sort of post-disaster context in Staten Island. And so people had experienced this very traumatic event, but also many people had lived in the neighborhoods that tried to get bought out for upwards, at least 20 years. I think 20 years was sort of the average, and had been there for a long enough time to experience multiple flooding events and also see the situation not getting better, if anything, getting worse. And there was a lot of mistrust that, and sort of cynicism that government would do much to kind of help them stay there. And if that did happen, the sense that, okay, New York City's waterfront, again, is broadly gentrifying. If there were more investments, would it just wind up kind of displacing the people who had been there? And so I think there was a sense that buyouts were kind of the best possible option, and that there weren't a lot of good ones. And so that the whole history of disaster had a lot to do with that. Whereas I think somewhere like Del Mar and in many places in California, where there is this sense, there's not kind of the hurricane threat, a lot of the kind of discourse around disasters is more linked to fires. I think there is a sense that, sea level rise is kind of a future slow moving threat. And the more immediate threat is government planning for these events and for climate change that can have all of these, unintended consequences. I think, certainly the socioeconomic, status matters, that people, there are people who have enough resources that feel like they can just absorb the risk and they can kind of protect themselves. That was certainly not the case for people in Staten Island. But I think there's also a difference between, who are you sort of hearing these attitudes from? And often in newspapers, they're quoting local officials. The same was true in Staten Island, where many local officials were like, nobody wants to retreat. Everybody wants to rebuild, because that is kind of the line that's taken. I think that's true of many local governments, and it may not map on to attitudes of people on the ground. That really depends. I think, Madeline, in your follow-up question, you asked whether there were things like willingness to face climate change risks as well. And I think one thing that was surprising to me in Staten Island is that many people, it's a very politically conservative part of New York City. Many people did not want to talk about what they were doing as climate change adaptation, didn't want to talk about climate change, didn't necessarily think another storm like Sandy would happen. And climate change was really not part of the public conversation there when people were talking about buyouts or retreat, which was surprising. It was much more about returning the shore to this remembered kind of past state when there were more wetlands and kind of more of a sort of reliance on collective memory rather than kind of calculations by outside experts.
One of the other questions, thank you for that answer. And one of the questions that follows from this, and you may be able to answer, or Dan or Ryan also, someone asked early on, anonymous attendee asked, is there a reason that FEMA buyouts haven't taken place as much in wildfire cases? Do you expect this trend to continue? Does anybody have any insight into this question?
I think Ryan has a good perspective on it as well. I'm sure some of the other panelists too. I think predominantly FEMA has been in response to hurricanes, floods, and similar events along those ways, so storm-wise and tornadoes and so forth. Wildfires have been historically viewed as kind of a more local phenomenon, even the fires that are, huge number of acres. Now we're sliding into some territory where they are true national impactful events. And so I think there's been some bias towards those other types of catastrophes rather than wildfires. They don't even have a program underneath their traditional means of having such a buyouts. And this is why I think it's so important that we have science to back it up. Because unlike a flood event where you can go after a flood event, mark the surface of where the extent of the floodwaters were, a wildfire can be very dependent on the type of event it was. Is it a wind-driven event versus a terrain or fuel-driven event? You'll have a different outcome. And so there's some things that we can do to modify that, to minimize those impacts. But I think that FEMA and a lot of the emergency services agencies responsible for recovery haven't caught up to that yet. And so that's where the science is really going to help, I think, be convincing on this over time.
Yeah, and what I would add is, as Dan was saying, we've had over, I don't know when it began, but the National Flood Insurance Program, that it's been around, I'm sure, for decades. There is not an equivalent at scale for fire. And I am not an expert on this by any means, but I would go back to what Dan was saying earlier. Look at California for an example. The scale of wildfires just in the last 10 years has exploded, literally exploded. And so the policy and the legislation and the funding, takes a while to catch up. And I would imagine as these wildfires, in particular in California and the West in general, continue to grow, that we will eventually see something akin to a national flood insurance program for fire, but not yet.
And I will say that's why we feel some urgency on, through non-traditional means, developing some demonstration areas, some models. We're using park funding to, yes, create a park, but also it's going to serve as a model that's going to check some boxes as far as resiliency of the community and fire prevention. And that could be modeled, quantified, and so forth. So that's an open invitation, I think, to whoever may be on the line here to, help us with that quantification. And, I think it becomes very, we'll shift to a more rational way of dealing with these large catastrophic fires than what we have today.
Well, we're talking a lot here about the post-disaster, and I want to get back to the pre-disaster side of things. And I think, Jessica, you may have some insight into this as well as Dan and Ryan. A lot of the support for communities, whether it's through government, the private sector, or philanthropy, becomes available only after communities have been affected by disasters. Especially with what you're talking about with Jessica, I'm interested in asking, how can we change the support systems so that communities can access them to prepare for climate threats? Pacoima has been getting a lot of grants. Paradise, was lucky, or Chico and Paradise were lucky to be sort of sister cities and to have the resources of a lot of people there. But a lot of communities don't have that infrastructure. So I wonder if you could address that for us.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things, putting Paradise and Pacoima, up in conversation with each other is that, in Pacoima, the biggest climate threat is extreme heat. So it's, a much slower burn, pun maybe a little bit intended, than, the kind of disaster threats that we see with fire in Paradise. And so, we can address that both at the larger kind of street infrastructure, waterway infrastructure, storm water infrastructure side, but it's a household, the building envelope that is where communities are going to be affected most in terms of their ability to confront the climate threat that they're facing, which is extreme heat and being able to survive extreme heat. And so, for a community like Pacoima, where there are a lot of unpermitted buildings, we need policies that help with bringing either housing up to code or amnesty programs, as well as really financially accessible heat weatherization programs that aren't currently available to residents, either because they can't physically make the changes because of the way their buildings are currently constructed, or financially because of debt obligations or not being able to meet mortgage and lending and other financial programs because of their revenue or because they can't leverage. Yeah.
I'll jump in. So two things. One is, as I mentioned, although we are working in a post-fire landscape in Paradise, really the lessons that we're trying to learn there are hopefully applicable and transferable to similar communities in California and elsewhere. The second thing I'd say is Dan mentioned the Building Resilience in Communities program, BRIC program that FEMA manages. Up until 2 or 3 years ago, FEMA did not have a forward-thinking program looking at advanced mitigation. And that changed, I believe it was around 2019 or so. Someone can correct me if I have the year wrong. But that's when the Nature Conservancy and other partners were able to change federal legislation to get FEMA to set aside approximately 5% of its annual budget to focus on pre-disaster work. And so the BRIC program, which Dan and folks in Paradise are trying to tap into, is a great example of that. Is using those funds to plan out how do we, restructure, reconfigure, plan a little bit differently to avoid future fires. And so that's, although it's only 5% of FEMA's budget, that's still quite a bit of money because of the size of their annual budget. But it's still only 5%. But it's a start. And again, this is only a few years old, but I'm expecting that this program will probably grow. And a lot of other communities are starting to look at how they can tap into it. Here in California, that money is administered by Cal OES. So there's a lot of opportunity now to start looking at how communities can prevent these types of these disasters through that program.
Brian's mentioning something that's really important about the kind of being proactive. We tend to be very reactive on it. You think about California, there is a little bit of a paradigm shift, I think, for all of us is there's not really pre and post disaster of anything. We're just in between disasters. So, for Butte County, the year before we had the near failure of Oroville Dam, followed by the Camp Fire, followed by COVID, some of these kind of completely different events, but yet they have some overlap and responses that we need to think about. Last year we had the Dixie Fire, the ignition source a few miles from Polga, which was the source of the Camp Fire. And so 1 year, essentially to the day, or 1 year, less than 1 year, for some folks, they were under evacuation order even after being burned out the year before. So I think we're always going to have to be thinking proactively. And I think one aspect I think is important to recognize is the top down, the larger agencies have a role, but also the local agencies have had a tremendous role in recovery. And yet we have very few resources that are set up for it. We're a poor rural county that as an agency, we don't have the same resources as some that are, more affluent areas of the state that are better equipped to handle the planning aspects, to handle that. So I think an aspect that would be very important is being able to provide not competitively, but some resources to organizations that could be on the leading edge of recovery, but don't have that expertise on even how to fill out the application forms, which can be very technical. And so there's not that support to help them succeed. So I think there's some big improvements there that could help with the entire state.
Well, we're coming close to the end. We have time for, I think, one sort of pretty concrete question from Brian Sokolow. Has the TNC Paradise model looked at where important services should be located relative to resilience parks? I'm wondering, for example, about whether there are strategic places where hospitals should be located to increase protection in wildfire scenarios.
I'll take the first stab at that. I think that that's a great question, Brian. One of the things that Paradise had prior to the campfire was a very well-regarded hospital. And that was actually a reason the older population here sought this community. That was on the eastern edge of town. And I think that would be definitely something that we're looking, one of our target areas, to expand a buffer in there to create a little bit more elbow room for that hospital to withstand the next catastrophe. So I think that type of infrastructure is important. Also, what type of refugia locations throughout the community? And so that's something that's going to be addressed through this BRIC program coming up. Not only the locations, but how do we finance that over a long period of time? So I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities that come up out of this next phase of the study.
Okay. Tim, do we have time for one more, or where do we stand?
I think you got one more. You got 2 minutes.
Okay. Also, a question addressed to Dan and Ryan. Please provide suggestions on fire-resistant community design. You have 1 or 2 minutes on the main things to consider, including suggestions to building code changes.
On the building code changes, I think they're starting to be a lot of recognition on that. Us as an agency, we're specialized. We're a special district, so we are focused on parks and recreation. We don't have some of the politics involved that the county may have, the town of Paradise might have on one department, the planning department being subject, or building department subject to rules and pressure from the community. We can provide an alternative vision. And so I think there's a lot more to be done on not only the code development, but the enforcement of code. And then what we're looking at from our standpoint is providing a new vision on what the community can provide. The areas, that fire behavior triangle that I mentioned is very important, but also the amenities that the community may need from a health and wellness standpoint. I haven't even touched on the impacts that has had on our community from a behavioral health standpoint, from a long-term recovery standpoint. We're developing programs in those areas. One of my colleagues talked about, how do we get kids to enjoy nature when they think nature is trying to kill them? So I think there's a disconnect there on just trying to engage with the community, have them embrace the area that we're living in, and learn how to live with fire in a logical way is going to be an important pathway for us moving forward. So no quick answers there, but I think there's a lot to come from that question.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over to Tim to sign us out.
Yeah, thank you. It was all super interesting and informative. Thank you, David, and panelists Liz, Jessica, Ryan, and Dan for sharing your expertise and your perspective. It was, again, really, really interesting. And thanks to the audience as well for joining us. I'll just mention that we will continue to organize programming on this critical issue, climate change, health, and the built environment. So please do stay tuned for future events. Take care.